I'm going to be introducing tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Farah Al-Nakib from the American University of Kuwait. She is the director for the Center of Gulf Studies, and she's obtained her master's and her PhD from SOAS, the highly prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies. And she's currently preparing a book that will be published by Stanford University Press about urban space in Kuwait, pre and post-oil. Her topic is going to be very interesting, and you might think, how does this fit into service? Her topic is a little bit talking about the physicals and the relation of physicals to culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Farah. I forgot to turn this on.
Thank you, Fatin, and thank you to everybody at Service Hero for inviting me to come and speak with you all this evening. I feel like a bit of an imposter standing here before you. As Fatin explained, I'm an urban historian, and I actually have very little experience in the corporate business world. But I ask that you please indulge me for the next 10 minutes, because I think there is a parallel to be drawn between the urban and corporate landscapes, particularly in the Gulf, so between what I write about and what you do. In the recent scholarly literature on urbanization in the Gulf, places like Dubai and Doha are increasingly labeled corporations, cities that are run like companies owned by the rulers and an elite circle of developers. One cannot think about Dubai's astonishing urban development of the past 15 years without an immediate association with the much publicized grand vision of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. Kuwait stands somewhat apart from its southern neighbors in this regard, as there is a much greater balance of power between the rulers and the ruled here. However, it remains similar to the rest of the Gulf in that since the advent of oil, city planning and development have been top-down processes with next to no public participation. Gulf cities today are presented as the, quote, global headquarters of the new entrepreneurial and forward-looking. Local rulers employ what's known as starchitecture, or iconic attention-grabbing buildings by famous architects, as a way of branding their visions and creating an image that is mainly targeting a global audience. The problem is that most emphasis tends to be on building a spectacle of modernity, wealth, and power, mainly geared towards a global audience, rather than on satisfying local needs. The everyday life requirements and desires of the permanent or long-term inhabitants of these cities are rarely taken into consideration when planning these spectacular urban landscapes. But cities, like companies, are not just shiny buildings. They are first and foremost composed of people, residents, like your companies, like you have your customers and your staff. As all of you in this room know, excellence cannot be created by focusing solely on a superficial image. A nice logo or a prime location. Oops, I skipped ahead. Okay. Nor can it be achieved by concentrating solely on outmarketing your competitors. A truly successful company has to have a vision that gives its human interactions top priority. Cities work the same way. Although in the Gulf we have constructed landscapes that have captured the awe and imagination of people all around the world, none of our cities are places that encourage a dynamic and diverse everyday life for the people who live and work here. The companies being recognized tonight are those that have gone beyond the glitz and glamour of the image and understand the needs, values, and demands of the people they engage. This is something that cities in the Gulf, Kuwait included, have yet to fully appreciate. Now, Kuwait today is often described as lagging behind its Gulf neighbors. Over the past decade, other parts of the Gulf have implemented rigorous development programs to carve out niche identities for themselves. Not sure why this isn't advancing. Okay. So Dubai is a global financial center, Abu Dhabi is the region's new cultural capital, Doha has an international sports center, and so on. Kuwait seems to be missing from the game, and the common rhetoric you hear both in Kuwait and outside is that the country is tangled up in its own political deadlock and has therefore fallen behind. This is perhaps epitomized by the national marketing tagline that was popular in Doha a few years ago: Kuwait is the past, Dubai is the present, Doha is the future. But is the fact that Kuwait is not actively participating in the race to become the regional capital of something or other, shopping, tourism, culture, education, sports, is that necessarily a bad thing? We all know that Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha have become famous for their building projects designed by world-famous architects like Rem Koolhaas, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Norman Foster. What most people don't know is that Kuwait actually began this process in the 1970s. After the 1973 oil boom, the Kuwaiti government commissioned a very impressive list of international giants to turn Kuwait into a world-class pantheon of architectural modernism. Kenzo Tange from Japan designed the new airport. Denmark's Arne Jacobsen designed the central bank, and Jorn Utzon of Sydney Opera House fame designed Kuwait's National Assembly, and Reima Pietila from Finland designed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some, like Malin Bjorn's Kuwait Towers, received prestigious awards and put Kuwait on the map of international architecture. But this focus on building masterpieces to, quote, mark the new city of Kuwait as a great capital city, as one government brief described it in 1968, came at the expense of producing a functional and coherent landscape that could better serve the needs and desires of the people living within it or just beyond in the suburbs. The city had no usable public spaces to allow for the cultivation of a vibrant civic life. The city became increasingly uninhabitable as the government did not invest the kind of money spent on architectural masterpieces in building suitable housing, improving infrastructure, or providing public services in the city. Sidewalks were and remain unwalkable. Traffic congestion was and remains a nightmare. And until the 2003 building boom, much of the land in the city sat empty, derelict, and unused due to artificially inflated land values that made speculation more lucrative than development. Planning and development after 1950 focused more on creating an image of Kuwait as a modern progressive oil state than on producing a usable city for its own inhabitants to enjoy. Over the past couple of decades, we've seen similar processes taking place in the UAE and now in Qatar. Once again, architecture and urban development are geared much more towards projecting a brand image than satisfying everyday human needs. Places like Rem Koolhaas's Dubai waterfront city, as one European architect working for a UAE developer has said, quote, have to be consumed very quickly. It's kind of like a drive-through takeaway. The quality of space, continuity, and social concerns is subordinated to the image, the icon, the consumption value, end quote. Is this drive-through lifestyle really what the people who have to live permanently in these cities value and desire? Probably not, but we don't know that because public participation is never part of the planning process in the Gulf. This is a very unsustainable approach to urbanism, city building, and civic life, but has been the approach that local developers led by governments have taken for most of the past decade. The unsustainability of this model was made salient in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis. By October 2011, canceled or suspended projects in the UAE reached $191 billion. Enter Qatar. Kuwait is the past, Dubai is the present, and Doha is the future. This narrative emphasizes a notion of competition between the states, that each has its moment in the limelight and then gets trumped out by its more able competitor. Indeed, Gulf states spend much of their developmental energies trying to outdo each other with new superlatives, the biggest, the tallest, longest, most expensive, and so on. At a 2007 Harvard workshop on sustainable architecture in the Gulf, a PR official from a large Abu Dhabi real estate developer that said that for 30 years Abu Dhabi suffered from the stigma that it never developed anything. Quote, we can't wait because we're already behind and speed is our biggest challenge, end quote. Whereas first it was the rest of the region trying to catch up to Kuwait, since 2003, Kuwait has been trying to catch up with its neighbors. But we don't seem to have a clear vision or identity that we're trying to evoke like our neighbors do. Kuwait, in other words, is not successfully conveying a national brand image, and this lack of spectacle is translated as it's being left behind. But Kuwait doesn't actually need to play catch-up. Unlike what that PR guy said about Abu Dhabi, Kuwait achieved a lot over the decades since the 1950s. Not just architecturally, but also socially. It once had the best education system in the Middle East, if we can believe that today. Politically, it was and remains the only state in the Gulf with a real legislative body. And culturally, it opened its first local art gallery in the 1960s, in which Andy Warhol exhibited, and it qualified for the FIFA World Cup in 1982. Kuwait's current inability to successfully project a distinct and flashy brand identity to compete with its neighbors may suggest that it doesn't actually need to. Kuwait can always enjoy knowing that it was there first and can move on to address not why it might be behind Dubai and Doha, but why it is behind where Kuwait itself was back then. This is important not to prove something to the world, but to answer to and engage its own people who are becoming more and more vocal about the country's failures and stunted development. Rather than just building an image, we could potentially put our focus where it belongs, on creating a healthier, happier, and more dynamic everyday life for the people who live and work here. It is in this way, rather than in building the world's tallest twisted skyscraper, that Kuwait can once again serve as a model and inspiration for the region, that it could potentially win a Service Excellence Award. A couple of years ago, an interesting discussion emerged on the Re-Kuwait blog between its two authors, both young Kuwaiti architects, in response to the government's intention to build 8 new theaters as part of the latest economic development plan. While both agreed in the need for more cultural spaces, a debate ensued as to whether Kuwait needs a starchitect masterpiece, like a Zaha Hadid opera house, or an unspectacular but more coherently designed urban landscape, like a walkable theater district. Either way, both stressed the need for greater public participation in the planning process. Public participation means a mechanism by which the city's everyday users and inhabitants can voice their opinions, express what they really want in their city, tell the planning authorities where they've gone wrong and what they've done right, and so on. So similar to Service Hero. As you know, you cannot run a successful company without this kind of public input. So how is it that we build our cities without this knowledge? So this is the question that I would like to leave you with tonight. Does Kuwait need to create a superficial brand image to compete with its neighbors, or does it need to produce a more sustainable environment better suited to the needs and desires of its own inhabitants? On a night that we're celebrating service excellence, I think we might all agree on which of the two we think is more important for long-term success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. Can you hear me again?